When I started as a prospectus reader a long time ago at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, the world was completely different. Things have changed dramatically, and the recent study confirmed exactly what you just said. I think it was in Germany where a study found out that young people now who start their career, who come from university, they have their first money to invest in securities. They will never go, or the study clearly showed that they will not go to a banker and look at prospectuses and then decide on where to invest. They will go on the internet and look precisely also at projects where they want to invest in, and not really at issuers. Also, I think this will also change in the future. Young investors will rather look at the project they will invest in, an idea, than on an issuer. So I think there is indeed a lot of change to come in the next time. On the other side, I must say that the prospectus regime, which is in place now since 2005, has nevertheless harmonized somehow the European framework for prospectuses, for listings, for offers to the public. So also some positive elements from what has been done in the past. It has become easier for investors also to compare investments in the various European countries and above. Obviously, the more negative point, the criticism which we have also heard on stock exchanges side, is that the current regime is too restrictive. The requirements are too onerous, too burdensome, and the prospectuses are simply too long, and they will never be read by investors. And so the question remains: what is the best way to protect investors? There is this whole discussion about the prospectus, the long prospectus, the summary, the key investor document, and the combination of both elements. So I think this is ongoing discussion, and I think regulators have not yet found the best way to, on one side, give disclosure on issuers and protect investors at the best way. A little bit disappointing also when you look at, and this confirms also what you have just said before. You mentioned that the number of listings has been decreasing over the last year, and this has also been confirmed by the recent publication of ESMA on the prospectus approval activity in Europe, which has now been published a few days ago or a few weeks ago, and where you can clearly see that the trend that less and less prospectuses are approved in Europe is going on. So it's indeed very disappointing that the prospectus approval activity is decreasing constantly, and obviously we all hope that this will now at least partially change also with the new regulation. Obviously the prospectus directive and the prospectus regulation is a very important piece of legislation for stock exchanges, and that's precisely why also on FESI level this has been extremely or followed extremely closely, and a lot of lobbying has also been done and input has been given during the initial discussions. And one particular point I would like to mention was the discussion about the wholesale and the retail regime, where fortunately then the result is that now there are still various ways to have to protect the wholesale regime with a lighter version, lighter requirements for those issuers who are only targeting the wholesale market and not targeting retail investors. And obviously, one of the newly introduced concepts is the wholesale-only market, where there are a lot of expectations nowadays, be it from issuers but also from investors. And ICMA is also insisting a lot on this and is following this very closely to see how stock exchanges will actually be able to have these kind of markets closed to retail investors. And I must say it's not an easy task, and how to see how far can you go and how can you make sure that on the secondary market, if you have trades going on the secondary market, that the securities will not end up in the hands of a retail investor. Just a few comments on 4 points of particular interest for stock exchanges, I must say. Obviously, it's the EU growth prospectus with where we can only confirm that the current regime for SMEs was not really very attractive for SMEs in Europe. So we can only support the ideas of the Capital Markets Union, that capital markets should be an alternative way of financing for small and medium-sized companies. Hopefully this objective can be better achieved now with the second attempt to do it. And then as you correctly said at the beginning, the challenge will be obviously to strike the balance between, on one side, the needs of those issuers in terms of disclosure, etc., and at the same time combining this with a perfect and a good investor protection. Obviously, then you could have discussions also going in the direction that you could even have large issuers, large frequent issuers who come to the market on a regular basis. They could say, well, is this really fair now that these small companies who come for the first time to the market are obviously, there is a higher risk for an investor to invest in these companies, and at the same time, the regulators then say those issuers need to give less disclosure than large, well-known issuers where all the information is already available. So I think that's also a point to consider in that respect. Comparability of these growth prospectuses is also important. I think it will be important on level 2 and level 3 that a certain harmonization will also be achieved on the European level, that the difference between the different countries will not be too important, and to have really a level playing field in that respect. The question will also be who will be the issuers using these SME markets, the EU growth prospectuses. Will it really be the traditional small and medium-sized companies? Because we have already seen also requests from SPVs, issuers of asset-backed securities, who asked us, well, potentially we would be in the scope of this, and maybe we could also use this EU growth prospectus to issue asset-backed securities. So I think that's also something to consider carefully, that they will not be misused by certain categories of issuers. And then also important for stock exchanges overall is in fact the positioning of these new SME growth markets, where you have this EU growth prospectus compared to the existing MTFs. As you all know, most of the European stock exchanges nowadays, they have also MTFs in place for equity, but also for debt securities. And I think it will be important to see what the advantage will be for an issuer to be on this new type of market compared to the existing ones. Because that's all I just mentioned. It has been mentioned that the number of issuers listing on regulated markets is decreasing. But on the other side, and at the same time, the number of issuers listing on these MTFs is increasing. So more and more issuers, smaller ones, but also larger ones, are opting for these existing MTFs. They are functioning relatively well, but they are not at all harmonized today. It's really up to the national regulators or even to the national stock exchanges to decide what the disclosure requirements for these markets are. And so I think that will also be a very important point to consider, that there must be an incentive also and some real added value for an issuer to come to this market rather than to the existing MTFs, because especially for SMEs, it is fair to say that typically when they issue securities, be it equity or debt, they are typically placed nationally, domestically. So prospectus will probably not be required in many cases, and so it will be important that those issuers still see an advantage to come to these markets. Short comment also on the universal registration document. I think stock exchanges overall support the idea to harmonize also financial reporting, also aligning it with the transparency directive, transparency obligations overall. And if a faster approval process can be achieved by this, that's obviously positive for issuers. Now, which issuers are likely to use this URD? Obviously, that will be large issuers, frequent issuers, typically banks, who have an equity listing and who are issuing also debt securities on a regular basis, they might potentially see the advantage of using this universal registration document, and potentially also large corporates who are in a similar situation. A question which we get regularly nowadays is how can the URD be used in the context of a base prospectus? Because, as you know, most of the large frequent issuers, they all have base prospectuses in place, programs which function very well. And so the question for them is, what will be the added value for us to have a URD in combination with our base prospectus, because the base prospectus has to be updated anyway. And so we don't really see the interest to have now this URD together with our base prospectus. So that's one of the challenges. Quickly also a short comment on the base prospectus regime. As it has been said, the base prospectus regime, in our view, is functioning quite well nowadays for the large issuers. Most of the large issuers obviously use it, be it for funding issues, so for really debt securities for funding purposes, or also for structured investment products, which are typically issued under these programs. One of the topics which has not yet been discussed is the use of the so-called drawdown prospectuses, and we see in practice that many issuers are also using these drawdown prospectuses, which are basically final terms issued under an existing base prospectus, but where there are some changes made to what has been in the base prospectus and will then be approved by the regulator in the specific case. So that's very, very frequent nowadays. We regret a little bit the fact that the new regulation has not included the possibility to incorporate future financial statements. We think that this would also give a lot of flexibility to program issuers, the possibility to say we incorporate all our future financial statements by reference in our base prospectus. Overall, I think the changes to the summary requirements are very positive. The fact that no summary will be required any longer in the base prospectus, but only in the final terms. That's overall quite positive. A little bit surprised by the fact that the kit, the PRIPS kit, can, if the national competent authority wants to have it, then it should be attached to the final terms. That's a bit surprising that this freedom is given to national competent authorities, because either you could say it is important or it's not important, but why leaving this to the national competent authority? Then finally, the ABC categories. Overall, we don't really like this categorization because it reduces the flexibility for issuers. In particular, if, and it has also been said before, issuers should have the possibility to give more information than what is strictly required. If I look, for example, at the green bonds market, if an issuer issues a green bond under an existing program, he will have the obligation to put the use of proceeds section in the final terms. And if you're only targeting wholesale investors, that is not possible. And so why not giving those issuers the possibility to say in the final terms, well, this is a green bond, this is what I'm doing with my proceeds. So yeah, overall, not a lot of flexibility. Scrutiny, I will not now go into detail of that. Maybe one comment on this is a finding which we have, and probably also the other colleagues from the stock exchanges represented, is that issuers report regularly that the comments which they receive nowadays from national competent authorities, from the regulators, are about the form of the prospectus and not on the content. And to give you one example, we had one Italian issuer recently who had his base prospectus approved in one European country, and then he switched the listing venue to another country. So he basically filed the same base prospectus with really some minor changes, and he got 116 comments from the regulator. And it was all about the form. Right? precisely things where the first regulator said, no, you should do it this way, and then the second regulator said, no, you should do it this way. So that would be our message also. Don't overemphasize on the form, but rather on the content.